to talk about a very big topic, this struggle that's going on in Europe. And I've tried to narrow this talk down to a political analysis of the class struggle in three European countries, France, Greece, and Spain, where there recently have been national elections in France and Greece reflecting elements of that struggle. In Spain, where there was a mass demonstration last week of their version of the Occupy movement. Their version came first, by the way. They called the indignados, the indignant ones. But since we're dialecticians, we can hardly be expected to look at these events in isolation. To make sense of them, we'll first go global. I want to just say a few words about the overall capital economic crisis and how it impacts on all the countries and on Europe, and then look at the political fallout in the three countries in more detail. I don't know if any of you got to read Fred's Goldstein's article on China this week, and I'm not going to go into that so much, except that there was one thing he brought up from it, and that was that the crisis has now entered another downturn, and that it's affecting all the countries, including the ones that seem to have escaped the first wave of the crisis in 2008, Brazil and Russia and India and China. And because of the downturn in growth in Japan and the United States, and because of the absolute downturn in Europe, which has knocked off demand that these other countries were supplying stuff for. And mainly in Europe, they are going through negative growth. They're having another recession right now. So that's what I wanted to call attention to. And this has been sort of festering for the last year or so. And it's had a political impact. Now, in general, over the last 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years is the best way to measure it, because it sort of started with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, that there has been a gradual decline in the standard of living of the European working class, which had sort of risen pretty quickly between the end of the World War, when everything was devastated, but really between the 1960s and to the 1970s and 80s, and there was what they called sort of a social welfare state throughout most of Europe, especially Northern Europe. And most people who had a job, and most of them had jobs, were able to have home, have a car probably, raise a family, and have medical care and education pretty much available. At a level, I mean, the wealthier people weren't as wealthy as the wealthy people in the United States, but the general level was very high. That has been declining ever since, and it's been declining even in wealthy countries like Germany, where the economy has been working well over the last 10 years for the ruling class. It hasn't been working that well for the workers, and the workers' income has gone down, maybe 10%, something like that. And of course, if theirs go down, it means that the bosses get a bigger piece of what's being produced. And their profits go up. And they're also, since they're operating and selling a lot within Europe, they're using the same currency all throughout Europe, their goods can be sold cheaper than a lot of the other goods that are produced in the other countries there. And that has led to an imbalance within Europe, with a lot of the money flowing to the countries in the north, especially to Germany. And that's where the big banks have been loaning money to Greece and Spain and some of the other countries. And in Greece particularly, it hit hard because they weren't able to pay back the loans. They had to borrow money, for example, to buy weapons. Since they're part of NATO, they have to buy weapons. They buy the weapons from German companies, probably, or French companies, who are maybe British companies who are selling them. And they wind up in debt, and then they have to pay it back. And the politicians who are in charge of the European Union are the ones that are connected to the big European banks. And their decision has been, over this last period, that everyone should give priority to paying back the money to the banks. So they've demanded from all of the countries that they keep their budgets, their national budgets, they make the cutbacks, they fire workers, they do the kind of things that happen in the cities and states over here are being demanded of sovereign countries in Europe, or countries that believe they were sovereign, or some people believe were sovereign, that they have to give the first priority to paying back the bank. That comes first, everything else comes second. The impact in Greece has been to increase, or I should say exacerbate, the recession level, so that everything is stopped, or a lot of stuff is stopped. And right now, it increased a lot in the last 2 years, but the unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate, is more than 23%. So you can imagine that's pretty severe. I don't know how to measure it exactly with regard to the United States, because all these numbers are not necessarily measured in exactly the same way, and are not, but it says something, that when it's 23%, when almost one out of 4 people doesn't have a job. Maybe a stronger example of what's going on is that 1,500 people in the last couple of years have committed suicide for economic reasons in Greece. So that gives an example, an idea of the desperation. Now, Spain hasn't had the gun held to its head like the Greek government has. The Spanish government hasn't had that. But they themselves have been carrying out an austerity program, and the same kind of stuff is happening in these countries. Now, as I said, 2 of the countries had, there's a political reaction. I really want to go into the political consequences of this crisis tonight, more than go into try to analyze what's going on economically. Although there's a meeting going on right now in Camp David of the G8, where I'm sure this is going to be discussed, because it's a big issue whether Europe continues into the recession, if they try to stimulate it in some way, and they're arguing about it amongst themselves, and we'll hear stuff about it. But I'm going to talk about the political consequences in the individual countries. First, I'll talk first about Spain, since there wasn't an election in Spain. But what happened was that there has been a movement has grown up over there, separate and independent of the traditional working class movement, that is, in a lot of ways, is like the Occupy movement over here. It started on May 15th, 2011, that is a year ago. And the same sort of, the young people who have 50% unemployment, which means it's worse than here. Like here it's about 25% overall, right? So overall over there, it's 50%. So people who are going to school, graduating or not, whose parents perhaps graduated into a job either from high school or from college, they're growing up and they don't have a job. They can't get their own place. They can't start a family if that was what they were planning to do. They can't live out independently. So they're in an even more larger section of the society, larger percentage of the society than over here. You have the youth who they feel they're unable to start their lives. So they went into the square. And they took over the big squares, first in Puerta del Sol in Madrid, which is one of the big central squares, the most popular one, the one that has attracts more of a working class kind of population. and Plaza Catalunya in Barcelona. And then it spread to all the city. You know, there's dozens and dozens of small and medium-sized cities throughout the Spanish state, and also in Canary Islands and in Mallorca, and in almost every place, people went down and took the streets. And then for the first week or so, it was something like over here, the media was favorable to them, you know. There was even some agitation amongst the more sectarian of the left organizations that there's some kind of conspiracy going on or something, because the media was favorable to them. But that didn't last all that long, because it became apparent that these young people weren't just going out and blowing off a little steam. They wanted to stay in the square, and the squares became a place where you went down and you talked politics, just like Zuccotti Park here, but on a bigger scale even. And they didn't want to go into the electoral politics or even the union politics. And the main unions in Spain, by the way, have been pretty much conceding, especially when there was a social democratic government, so-called Socialist Party government. There was, they went along with the austerity program. So there was a lot of disillusionment about the union leadership, and rightfully so, and a lot about the electoral parties. They sort of turned their back on the electoral parties. So at that time, the media started to change their attitude toward the indignant ones, and they started, you know, sort of treat them like street bums and stuff like that in the media. And then the police went in and pushed them out of the squares. So there was battles. I mean, they didn't fight. I mean, they were like nonviolent resistance most of the time. But they nevertheless got beat by the cops. The cops were violent, in Barcelona anyway. And they pushed them out of the squares, but the movement continued, and it continued to exist as this independent movement. I saw an interview today with one of the people who's been writing about them a lot, and she was still optimistic that the movement has grown. And last week, they went back to the squares. Again, they got pushed out, but they went back in the tens of thousands. According to the demonstrators, they had almost 100,000 in Madrid and not many more in Barcelona, and then all over the country again, they went back out. So the movement is alive, and it's struggling against these the austerity program. And it's starting to develop its own program, but it's just beginning. It's starting to develop its own program. And I'm sure that some of the left groups are working within. This year, the media also baited them as having been taken over by the ultra-lefts and stuff like that. Now, this is probably not true, but it probably does mean that there are some left groups who are now functioning with them in some way. And, you know, people who have been active in the movement in 50 years, and the movement has declined, since, let's see, since Franco died in 75, 76, when the dictatorship was semi-ended, let's put it that way, because there was a compromise made at that time that maintained a lot of the same old ruling figures in the government and in the state apparatus, but allowed the political parties to contest on the parliamentary level and the unions to operate. So this has gone on, and they kept the king. There's still a king in Spain, believe it or not. They got rid of the king in the 1930s, but they brought him back as part of the deal with the fascists to end the regime without having a civil war. So anyway, that's where the struggle is at in Spain. I think it's interesting for us because it, probably more than any other place in the world right now, what the economy and what they're going through over there in Spain is very similar to the United States.